Alrighty, moving on in chapter 9, we are going to take a look at section 7, and we're going to divide this up into a couple different videos because it's a fairly long section. So we're not going to make it too long on any one part. So the overall theme of this section is intellectual development, and then we're going to talk a little bit about creativity, and we're going to talk a little bit about achievement. Now, the first section we're going to talk about, though, well, let's define them first. When we're talking about intelligence, we're talking about underlying competence or the ability to learn. All right? And when we talk a little bit later about one of the more famous ways that is used, or prominent ways that we use to measure intelligence, we're going to talk about Wechsler. And Wechsler has defined intelligence as, quote, the capacity to understand the world and the resourcefulness to cope with its challenges, right, which I think is a great definition. And this definition is right in your book. When we're talking about achievement, we are talking about something that we attain through our personal efforts and is presumed to be made possible by one's abilities. All right. So, competence, like your book says, competencies underlying intelligence usually we start to be seen during middle childhood, and this comes out typically because we're exposed to formal schooling. So what we're capable of, what we may not be capable of, if there are any deficits, if there are any giftedness, tends to come out in this period. All right, what we're going to start with first in this section is talking about theories of intelligence. And there's kind of three ideas that are typically talked about when we talk about intelligence. There's the factor theory of intelligence, which we're going to talk about here. There's a different way to look at intelligence, which Sternberg has proposed, and then kind of a third, which Gardner proposed. So we're going to talk about each of them separately. And the first here is factor theories. And so the idea here with factor theory is that intelligence is one or more major mental ability. One or more. Now, the first guy to really talk about this in a scientific way was Spearman back in 1904. And what Spearman theorized is that intelligence has one common underlying factor, and he labeled this G, or general intelligence. And what he said, it represented broad reasoning and problem-solving skills. That's what G is, and the underlying factor of intelligence is this general intelligence. Now, Thurston took this a little bit further in the late 1930s, and he believed that our intelligence was several specific factors or several specific primary mental abilities, like the ability to learn words and visual spatial abilities. And Thurston's work really did sort of indicate that these factors were independent or stand alone from one another. Now, a little more modern day thought when we get to excuse me, intelligence. We have Sternberg as recently as 2011, and he constructed what he called a triarchic or three-part theory of intelligence. And you can see we have a little visual here. This is the same visual that's in your book. There's three parts. Part one is analytical intelligence, and this is academic ability. This is stuff we typically think of as intelligence: solving problems, comparing and contrasting, judge, evaluate, criticize, problem, those kinds of things we typically use in an academic setting. All right. Now, the second kind of intelligence that he talked about was creative intelligence, and this is our ability to cope with new situations and be able to learn from that experience. Things like inventing, discovering, theorizing what might happen. Those are all examples of creative intelligence. And then lastly, Sternberg proposed this idea of practical intelligence, how we adapt to the environment, especially and including the social environment. Can we apply knowledge in practical situations? What we typically think of as street smarts. Sternberg labeled practical intelligence. So their intelligence wholly comes from these three prongs, or these three areas: analytical intelligence, creative intelligence, and practical intelligence. All right, now not to be outdone, we have Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. And this was first proposed by Howard Gardner back in 1983, so a while ago. And it's still a relative concept in modern day psychology, as recently as 2011. Now, similar to Sternberg, Gardner believes that there are multiple kinds of intelligences, more than just what we typically think of as academic ability. Gardner's intelligences, though, are quite wide-ranging. So linguistic ability, is typical, what we more think of more academic, words and verbal skills. Then we also have logical, mathematical, which again is more like our typical educational skills. And then also there's visual spatial skills, which, if we look at our example here, is understanding form and shape. We have bodily kinesthetic, like dancers and gymnasts show us. We have musical intelligence, interpersonal intelligence, so how we get along with people. Intrapersonal, which is insight about ourselves. Existential, which is understanding sort of the world around us and how we relate to one another, kind of philosophical, spiritual. And then we also have something like as the naturalist, so being understanding the world around us. And so what Gardner says is that all of these work together to form our overall intelligence. So it's not just one kind of G factor, and it's not even three. It's multiple intelligences about multiple aspects of our lives.